Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from today. We're going to wait 1 minute or two just before we get started to allow more people to log in. Thanks so much for joining us. Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled that you've joined Systems Change Lab for this conversation on the state of industry. I'm Rachel Jettel, co-director of Systems Change Lab, and I sit within World Resources Institute. We're happy that you've all joined us for today's discussion, which we're co-hosting in partnership with Bezos Earth Fund, Climate Action Tracker, and World Resources Institute. This is the fourth in a series of webinars from Systems Change Lab that focus on systems transformations by sector. Today's conversation on decarbonizing industry couldn't be timelier on the heels of last week's Clean Energy Ministerial and the exciting developments being announced in the areas of cement, steel, and hydrogen, among others. And in case you missed the previous webinars in this series, and this is the first time you're tuning in, I'll begin with just a few brief opening remarks on systems change with a broad picture of what's needed in the industry sector to stimulate a low carbon transition and meet net zero goals by mid-century. After that, I'll hand over to our moderator, Angela Anderson, who is the Director of Industrial Innovation and Carbon Removal at World Resources Institute. And Angela will moderate today's panel with the speakers that you see here on your screen. We're really excited to have today Noah Deitch, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy, Devika Wattal, Innovation Consultant at the Global Cement and Concrete Association, or GCCA, and Damian Vangenation, the Senior Policy Advisor at E3G. Welcome, everybody. So as many of you know, the scope of the global challenges ahead of us are quite clear: to limit global temperature rise, to protect biodiversity loss, and to build a just economy. Nearly every major system will need to transform, including how we power industry, which we'll talk about today, how we grow our food, how we build our cities, conserve nature, and beyond. And at the same time, cross-cutting transitions must also occur in political, social, and economic systems. So to create this sustainable and just future where we don't just survive, but actually thrive, we must navigate these global crises with a systems lens. That's why we created Systems Change Lab to respond to the urgent need for these transformational changes. We've identified over 70 critical shifts needed to protect both people and planet. And these shifts range from developing solutions for industries like steel, cement, and plastics that we'll talk about today, to extending financial services to underserved communities, to restoring deforested and degraded land, to adopting more holistic indicators of economic well-being, and much, much more. Together, these shifts can disrupt the status quo and create system-wide change. And within each shift identified, Systems Change Lab measures how much progress has been made toward 2030 and 2050 Paris-compatible targets, as well as enablers and barriers of systems change. We'll get into that too later. Last year, we developed a new open source data platform that serves as a virtual situation room to showcase all of this research, analysis, and interactive data visualizations. So to dive into industry, industrial activities accounted for a fifth of direct global greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. This number is nearly 30% when you include indirect emissions from power and heat. We also know that industry's emissions have risen faster than any other system since 2000. To avoid even greater impacts of the climate crisis, we need to decarbonize the industry sector. And as you'll hear from our panel today, achieving net zero emissions from industry is possible. With that, the next slide shows you the 5 shifts needed to transform industry that we've identified. I'll go over those really quickly. So first, we'll need to reduce demand for industrial products like cement, steel, and chemicals that increase greenhouse gas emissions. And to do this, we need to mainstream material efficiency and circular economy principles. Second, improving energy efficiency has huge potential to mitigate over 40% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 across all sectors. Third, sourcing energy in industry from electricity using renewable sources and already commercially available technologies can substantially mitigate GHG emissions. About half of the fuel that industrial companies use for energy could be electrified and decarbonized with commercial technologies coupled with a zero carbon power supply. Fourth, alongside eliminating energy-related emissions, we also need new solutions and production methods to tackle process emissions resulting from chemical reactions inherent in industrial activities such as cement and steel production. The need for high temperature heat is another key issue that has made these industries challenging to decarbonize, although new solutions and technologies are emerging. Clean hydrogen, for example, is a complex but important innovation that can address this from a process emissions perspective. And also rapid innovation in industrial heat pumps and new heating batteries can help to address energy-related emissions. And finally, rapidly reducing oil and gas production is crucial for lowering CO2 emissions. But minimizing methane emissions from oil and gas production as it's phased down is also essential, as methane is 84 to 87 times more potent than CO2 in the short term. So reducing methane will have an outsized impact on limiting warming in the coming decades. So when we look at the progress towards the targets that we have within each of these shifts, while some indicators are heading in the right direction, none are moving at the pace needed yet to meet 2030 goals. To transform the industry sector, we must make the products we need using less carbon. For example, we need to lower the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per metric ton of cement produced more than 10 times faster. And even though global green hydrogen production increased rapidly in recent years, the pace is far from sufficient to meet short-term goals and is complex to navigate. Encouragingly, though, when we look at electrification trends, the share of electricity in the industry's sector's final energy demand has risen between 2016 and 2020. So the current pace of growth is not far off from achieving near-term targets, and efforts would need to accelerate by a factor of only 1.7 to reach 35% by 2030. We also look at key enablers and barriers, and there are encouraging signs of progress and efforts when we look at these 5 categories of factors that enable or impede change. And I'm sure our panelists will reference many of these themes in today's discussion. These levers will all need to work in concert to help drive durable, transformational change. Because of course, there's no one solution. It'll take economic incentives, regulation and laws, shifts in behavior, innovation, and unwavering, courageous leadership. To pull out a couple of example bright spots we're seeing in the enablers and barriers that we analyze, we can look at innovations and enabling policy environments for cement and steel. So for example, from 2010 to 2019, the carbon intensity of cement has declined from about 691 to 656 kilograms of CO2 per ton of cement. This has been enabled in part by policies encouraging the use of alternative fuels for heat and cement production, as their share in the process almost doubled from 10% to 19% in the same time frame. With an innovation, we're also seeing some exciting progress and indicators that may drive future change with new low carbon steel projects that are being announced at an increasing rate over a span of just 3 years. In 2019, there were 9 announced projects, but that quickly increased to 21 the following year in 2020 and 51 the following year in 2021. So with that overview, I'm excited to turn this over to our moderator, Angela Anderson, the Director of Industrial Innovation and Carbon Removal in the Climate Program at WRI. She leads WRI's growing portfolio of work in industrial decarbonization and carbon removal aimed at enabling corporations and governments to meet net zero goals. Angela, welcome, and over to you.
Let me start with a question for you, Noah. The U.S. passed just a series of laws in the last couple of years that really make historic investments in decarbonize the entire economy. But I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about those provisions you think are going to be most transformational for industrial decarbonization.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And it's great to be here. I think the 2 laws that are going to have the biggest impact are the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. The first one provides tens of billions of dollars in grant funding for a range of projects that can contribute to industrial decarbonization. And it's really designed to subsidize early of a kind projects to get projects that are likely to be cost effective in the future, but have either a combination of technology, market, or policy risk still, to put steel on the ground and actually show that these technologies can be viable. The Inflation Reduction Act is a policy that's going to have a greater demand pull, if you will. It provides a wide range of tax credits that will, for the first time in many of these technologies' history, provide a significant demand pull that we believe is investable from private industry. And I think the interesting part of this framework is it's a significant departure from past attempts at climate policy here in the US. And it's notable for two reasons. The first reason is that it's an investment-only framework. There's carrots in these subsidies and grants, but there's no stick. There's no mandate that's telling anybody to do anything. So it's really a call to industry for action. And it's saying, look, the government is providing an enormous tailwind, and now we need industry to actually step up and take advantage of these credits. The other notable thing is that this is the policy framework that passed, and it's likely the policy framework that we are going to have for the foreseeable future. And so we don't really have any alternative besides making this policy framework as impactful as we can, so that in the future, in the 2030s and beyond, when we really need to deploy the technologies and start to make those major system changes, we'll be ready, we'll have the solutions, we'll have the human capital that's able to implement and deploy them. And it's really an exciting time to make that down payment on what we'll ultimately need to decarbonize industry in time to meet our climate goals.
Great. Thank you so much, Noah. Let me more formally recognize Noah as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Carbon Management. Noah oversees FECM's Carbon Management Program, which focuses on minimizing the climate and environmental impacts of fossil energy through diverse pathways such as carbon capture and storage, carbon removal, carbon utilization into products, and reliable CO2 storage and hydrogen production with carbon management. It's notable that this office used to just be the Office of Fossil Energy, and under this administration, it is now Carbon Management and Fossil Energy. Noah came to DOE from Carbon 180, which he co-founded to catalyze the development of carbon removal solutions. It's also the other half of my job. Moving on, Devika Wattal serves as the innovation consultant for the Global Cement and Concrete Association. She has 15 years experience working with a range of organizations, including the Asian Development Bank, Reliance Industries Limited, Battelle Science and Technology Limited, and the Indian Space and Research Organization. Her expertise includes techno-economic assessments, feasibility studies, technology and market trend analysis for carbon capture and utilization. She also serves as an advisor to the Climate Policy Initiative in India, in helping develop policies and financial frameworks for India. Devika, thanks so much for joining us. Often we talk about industrial decarbonization, we talk about cement and steel, in part because of their emissions profile, but also because they have some of the solutions that are most readily at hand. And the innovation in those fields is growing so rapidly. Can you tell us about those innovations, and also tell us what's happening in India to spur the decarbonization of that sector?
Right. Thank you, Angela, and I think thank you, WRI, for this opportunity. So I'm not sure how many in the audience are from the cement sector, but so just to, put things in perspective, concrete is actually the second most used material after water. I'm sure some of you might have heard it, but and over 60% of the emissions are process-based. It's not that we really can do something about it. These are all process-based emissions. Now, when we talk about the cement industry, the Global Cement and Concrete Association actually represents almost 80% of the global cement companies outside of China. And we also have an India chapter wherein we also represent almost 85% of the Indian cement companies in GCCA. So, having said that, the commitment from the cement industry is quite strong, because we understand we will be irrelevant if we do not look at these are all process emissions. We have to do something about it. And it's not that cement industry will tend to cease. So we have to be relevant, right? So if you look at the CCUS project deployments, when we look at the global cement industry, I think there are over 150 projects that are, they are at least mapped. But in addition to these projects, there are also some projects which are in the pipeline. They're not in a public domain. And this is a global scenario I'm talking about. Now, when we move a little closer, when we come towards India and see what's happening, yes, we do not have a lot of pilot installations or, not even one in cement. But it does not mean that nothing is happening. There are different level things are happening. I'm sure we'll talk about policies later. But when we talk about the commitment from the Indian cement industry, I think 2 years back with Asian Development Bank, I was a part of the team. And we developed a pre-feasibility for CCUS in an Indian cement for the Indian cement industry, and wherein we had found different pathways that can be used. But 2 years back, what the situation was and what the current scenario is when it comes to deployment of CCUS in the Indian cement industry, it has changed quite a lot. I think Rachel already mentioned having SEM 18 and MI meeting that was in India last week. It was really impressive, to be honest. I think it showed the commitment from government saying that this is high priority for us because CCU is not an option anymore. We have to do it. So coming from the governments, there was an interest from the financial sector and industry, the willingness of industry to do something to change that kind of mandate. I think that speaks a lot about the commitment from the industry. I hope I've answered your question, but yeah.
No, that's very helpful. Can you give us a little bit of a sense too of your views on the development of lower carbon energy sources for the industry, things like cement, electric kilns and clean hydrogen? Is that coming fast enough?
Okay. So GCCA had launched a roadmap for the cement industry, right? And in that roadmap, we had 36% of abatement for cement for CO2 emissions will happen only by CCUS, implementing CCUS. But in the roadmap, we had also mentioned that electrification of kilns could be something that will also help decarbonize cement. Now, when we look at that and we compare that to the Indian scenario, the cost of power in developing countries, not only India, but in developing countries, if you look at the cost of power, it might not be that feasible, maybe 1 year back, 2 years back. No, it wasn't the case. We could not have just started electrification of kilns in developing countries. But looking at the way hydrogen mission is picking up in India, it has become, I would say that, I see the government push, I see policies being developed, I see more and more stakeholders being interested in the whole clean hydrogen and, the infrastructure, talking about setting up infrastructures. So I think these low carbon technologies are on the rise. And I'm just, you can call me optimistic, but I'm hoping, the hydrogen mission is going to drive some of the CCUS projects as well. It's going to be, no one is going to win this race alone. We definitely have to work together to get there. So yeah, I see a lot of promising projects coming up. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Devika. We all know that investment is key. Noah talked about it. And I'm going to turn to Damian Vanjanichin. Sorry, hope I didn't butcher it too bad. Damian is a senior advisor at E3G. He works with NGO partners and industry stakeholders and policymakers on issues related to decarbonizing industry. His expertise is in industrial policy, carbon pricing, and carbon leakage protection. Damian, can you tell us a little bit about the EU's leadership in this space, and in particular what they've been doing to provide greater certainty for investment? And while you're speaking, we'd like to dive in a little bit more on how measures to promote decarbonization in the EU are likely to affect the industry globally. I'm thinking especially of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and some of the criticism it's received from developing countries.
Sure. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. There's a lot to unpack in that question. I'm going to try to sort of like tell the story of like industry decarbonization in Europe, because in all honesty, like it only has become like a priority in recent years. I think like historically, if you look at the last 20, 25 years, when we talk about climate action and industrial decarbonization, climate action was more seen as a threat to industrial competitiveness more than anything else. And the only real policy instrument that was in place was carbon pricing, was the emissions trading system. So that was the stick, as Noah might refer to it. But for industry, that stick wasn't really a stick, right? Because we were afraid of the impact of carbon pricing on industrial competitiveness. We essentially shielded industry away from that carbon price through free allowances. I think a lot has changed over the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, with the Paris Agreement, Europe has become very serious, or even more serious about climate action. Since 2019, we have climate neutrality enshrined into law. It's a legal obligation for the EU to become climate neutral by 2050. And the European Green Deal has completely changed the game. And the way we always look at it is like, in a climate neutral world, every sector has to become climate neutral, right? There's almost no way around it. And that has really sort of changed the political dynamics around how we approach industry decarbonization. And to put it very simple, the EU really tried to fix 2 problems. Like, one was, we needed to make carbon pricing work for industry. And the only way that the EU could conceivably see it doing that is to move away from free allowances. And the only way you do that is if you equalize the costs on a different way. So the way free allocation works is no one is paying the costs. The way carbon border adjustment mechanism works is basically, okay, we're going to implement those carbon costs for our domestic producers, but everyone that imports into the EU is also going to pay those carbon costs for their production. And that has sort of like unlocked the ability of the EU to do more through the sticks-based approach. But I think the real progress and the real innovation in terms of policymaking has been in all the other stuff that Europe has been doing over the last 5 years. To basically come to a realization that a stick approach alone, like, it will not cut it. Like, it will not make investments go fast enough. It will not make sure that some of these major reinvestments that are happening in the next 5 to 7 years, about 50% of our industrial assets in Europe, that they won't lock in fossil intensive processes. So the EU started slowly and in typical EU way, like slowly, fragmentedly, and like not always as nicely synergized as it should be. But it is putting in place this like more holistic policy framework for industrial decarbonization, right? And Noah, you've talked about, again, like demand pull instruments. Like we typically talk about both push and pull instruments, right? So like carbon pricing sits at the push side. There's lots of investments already going into like research and development, etc. I think we've especially seen an increased uptake in like investment in like early stage demonstration and pilot projects, etc. And what the EU is keeping busy with right now very much is the demand side thing. We're looking at green public procurement. Like, you have massive amounts of public money going into public procurement. How can we leverage that for green industries? We're looking at standards and product requirements, both to incentivize lower carbon, but also more uptake of secondary products, for example. We're rethinking a whole bunch of other types of policies related to circularity around end-of-life obligations, around material efficiency standards, etc. So it is a very big package that sits at different levels of jurisdiction. It might not be as clean cuts as tax reductions on certain investments, but like, I think it's very important to tell the story that it is a holistic picture. When it comes to the impact on third countries and global industries, like, I think a lot of the attention is going to the carbon border adjustment mechanism because it has this very visible impact on industrial producers abroad. And I think here it's most important to highlight, like, yes, that is a real impact. Yes, it can have negative impacts. And yes, the EU has a responsibility to, in part, address those issues. And I can come back to that later. But a lot of what the EU is doing is also early investments. It's also reducing the green premium. It's also making those technologies scale and become, over time accessible to other companies and countries across the world. So I really think we need to look at the holistic picture.
Thanks very much. We've talked a lot about what individual countries are doing, but of course there is a global marketplace out there and lots of collaborative initiatives underway. Now, I wonder if you can speak to how you see national and global policies and markets coming together, or how those global markets are influencing the decarbonization of industry, how it can help, and maybe where some roadblocks might be as a result of those complexities.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the contrast to Europe is a really interesting one, because Europe is a regulatory framework entirely based on legally mandated net zero targets in many cases. And the US is the opposite. We do not have a legally mandated target, nor do we have a regulatory framework. Instead, we have the subsidies to actually get the projects happening. And what we see is that these two systems are having similar impacts, just in completely different ways, in driving the ultimate decarbonization that we're going to need. It's just something that is unfortunately moving at a pace that is slower than we ultimately will need. Because what we see here is that in the US, we now have an enormous discount on a wide range of industrial decarbonization projects, not just carbon capture and hydrogen, but all of the electrification components and manufacturing in many cases that will be a part of that supply chain. But as I mentioned, there isn't that regulatory mandate. So even a project that is 50 to, in many cases, 80% off the overall cost doesn't get financed in the US, because there isn't that regulatory mandate. And then the same thing on the other side of the coin is that there are projects that with additional subsidies would be able to meet mandates in Europe much more cost effectively, and I think accelerate those timelines. But we haven't been able to see the appetite for European counterparts to provide the types of subsidies that we've seen here in the US. I think the bigger challenge that we see actually is outside of those two continents, especially across the global south, where in my mind, from where I sit, there's a myth around industrial decarbonization that it's difficult. I think it's actually not difficult from a technology perspective. I think it's just difficult from a financing perspective. And so the question is, how do we actually get the finance to the places that don't have the mandates and or the subsidy that we can have in Europe and the US respectively? And figuring out how to get that finance flowing, I think, is a really critical piece of this question that seems to be lagging the overall conversation in an important way.
That's very, very astute. Devika, do you have some thoughts on what gaps there are and supports needed to provide the kind of investment in the developing world to adopt these new technologies and make these changes?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Noah. You cannot drive investments if so I see it like, three pillars: governments, policies, and industry. The finance and the finance community, they can drive some part of it. Yes, there is a big gap when it comes to investing in a big project, or starting a big CCUS. I would say, whether it is cement, it is irrespective of any industry, but the investment is so huge that an industry alone cannot take the burden of just, okay, we'll do it. No, it's the viability gap is really huge. It's not possible for an industry to, do it on their own. But enforcing the kind of policies that will help the financial institutions also to, cover some of the cost, maybe government, like we have in the US, DOE is doing a lot of different kinds of grants they have in the US in place so that, it helps the industry, it works out between the industry, what it can be deployed, and the government policies also push the financial institutions to contribute bit to it. So when it comes to developing countries, yes, it is tough. I would say that, having policies in place is the first thing. But in one of the events in the like I mentioned, the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting that was a part of G20 events, I think Niti Aayog from the government of India, they had a very strong message that we are structuring different policies. Department of Science and Technology, government of India is also providing some of the grants, and I also see a lot of interest from financial institutions. Initially, there were a lot of barriers that people would not talk to each other because we really don't know what you're getting into, right? I mean, I would say the biggest barrier is public acceptance and awareness, which I would say has been the biggest barrier, and it is not only true for a developing country, but it has been a barrier in the developed countries as well. So I would say that is definitely one of the biggest barrier. Other than that, understanding that CCU, that is carbon capture utilization, is not the only it's not the only option. You have to have a storage. You have to understand that CCU will not work if you do not have storage infrastructure in place, which includes transportation, storage, and everything. So understanding different elements that are required for this whole value chain, it's just not carbon capture. It is to understand that we have policies in place, infrastructures in place, and the willingness from industry and financial institutions to work with the government. So my key message would be collaboration is the only way we can do this. That would be my main point here. Yeah.
I think that's an important, absolutely essential. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you all to address this question. This transition to decarbonized economies is going to require a lot of change for a lot of people. In particular, when you think about folks who have been, whose communities have been heavily dependent on the coal and oil industry, for example, when we think about folks who are concerned about the industrial facilities that have been polluting their communities, and they see us paying attention to the carbon coming out of those smokestacks, but are wondering what we're going to do about the other pollutants that are harming them. What do you think we can do, and what is government's role in making sure that those transitions, that the people that are affected by these transitions are engaged and taken care of, and that those fears perhaps not realized?
Would say it's a very tough question to answer, and I'm trying to really rack my brain to think of a good answer. But to be honest, I wouldn't say that I have a right answer to frame this. But maybe a philosophical answer would be more appropriate. See, I believe that the change is the constant. What works now will not work in another 30, 50 years. It will not work. And so I understand that a lot of people will be impacted by this transition in different sectors. But, when we talk about capacity building, and when we talk about if we are going to decarbonize these sectors, we will need a lot of people. It's not only up to the government to, implement policies or do things, but at the same time, we will need a lot of workforce. So I think pivoting in what you have been doing, and I think industries will also make sure that their workforce is in line with what is happening, to embrace this change. Because if we don't do this now, we actually don't have time, to be honest. We are doing everything we can, but I think, like what Rachel mentioned, we are not doing it fast enough. So I think this is the only option. I think government and industry together has to drive, this kind of capacity building. At the same time, doing these public, awareness programs, capacity building, which will help these people as well. Yeah.
Noah, you want to
Yeah, and Angela, I can jump in from how we think about that from a Department of Energy perspective. I think the department has an ambitious 2050 net zero goal that we're aiming for, but we're also committed to the president's Justice 40 initiative and making sure that all of our climate investments actually benefit the communities where they're being cited. And so towards that end, DOE for the first time ever is including a community benefits section for all of the grants that we make. And that section is weighted the same as some of the other sections around technology, business model, team, et cetera. And so it's really something that we're prioritizing as a department. And those community benefit plans have 4 major sections, one of which is focused on workforce. And while we can't require the project labor agreement, we do a lot of things to see that as the North Star and really work with the project developers to get really strong labor standards and protections, supporting workforce development and making sure that we're hiring from the community. In addition to that, we're focused on environmental protection. So not just making sure that these projects have strong life cycle carbon accountings to ensure that they're delivering the climate benefits, but making sure that we're addressing any non-CO2 air and water pollution as a part of the investment and have plans to mitigate and minimize that associated pollution. And then the last 2 pieces are really associated on the equity and justice side, where we're making sure that benefits go to disadvantaged communities and that the project teams are incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion in their teams. And so we're really striving to get to the place where folks feel that legally binding community benefit agreements are feasible and really that North Star that are not just the morally right thing to do, but are the type of agreement and effort that is going to enable project success. Because what we're seeing is that there's a lot of general opposition to infrastructure projects writ large in the US today. And figuring out how we can bring in those communities to the planning process and really enable them to share in the prosperity that these climate solutions can bring and protect them from any unintended consequences, I think is really important. But I will conclude that I think there's actually a really important role for civil society to play, because at the end of the day, many of the conversations that we start on the community benefit side are missing the why, if you will.
Yeah.
Folks are not tuned into what net zero industrial decarbonization actually is, why we need it, and what the options are to get there. And so what we end up facing is a lot of opposition to specific projects, but not advocacy for other projects that would achieve the goal in a different way. And so figuring out how we can get to this space where we're having really constructive conversations with communities about not necessarily just what they don't want, but how we can get what they do want that will enable us to achieve that deep decarbonization goal is something that's really important, and I think largely missing from many of the conversations that we enter into.
Really important caution there, and fun to think about how we can actually change that narrative and help people really feel like they're part of the solution. Domine, any thoughts on the transition before we move into Q&A from the audience?
I mean, definitely. I think I can echo a lot what Noah has said, and I think there's been a big realization at the European side that a lot of the policy innovation coming from the IRA and other recently passed American climate policy is not necessarily in the tax credits and in the climate policy, but in a lot of that attention to social justice and employment and local benefits, etc., which is, I think, something a lot of us are also coming to grips with. I mean, to build on your last point, perhaps, which is about like the role of civil society and like local communities. I mean, I would call it like a general need for like democratization of local climate policy, where on top of that, I would also see a lot, what we've seen historically is that climate policy is quite often top down, right? It's like the highest level of institution implementing the policies. or at least designing the policies, not necessarily implementing them. But we need to empower and enforce local governments for sure a lot more in order to like establish a lot of those dialogues, engage with local citizens, etc. But I also think, and that's sometimes overlooked as well, is that industries themselves need to proactively engage on this as well. And I think what we see on the ground is quite often that a lot of the industries that do need to decarbonize are traditionally a bit more conservative, perhaps, and historically have definitely pushed back along a lot of those decarbonization needs. So I do think there's definitely a shared responsibility there. And then beyond that, I think that there's a fundamental difference between certain industries and parts of the economy that might not be there anymore in a decarbonized world, or be there to a lot less extent, where we are talking fundamentally about, you know, social packages for stranded workers, but also, you know, diversification of local economy, reskilling, etc. And I think for a lot of the industries we're actually talking about today, it's a lot more about transforming how those industries operate and produce, rather than them, you know, being abolished altogether. So it is a very complex, local, place-based discussion, and there's no, you know, one policy fix all solution here, but it's one of the most crucial aspects of the transition for sure.
It strikes me that the environmental movement, I'm going to move into questions from the audience here now. And one of them deals with how, what role that the transition to a circular economy can play in decarbonizing industry. And just strikes me that recycling is one of the things that really took hold early in the 70s, when folks discovered, wanted to participate in environmental protection. And now we're really looking at the circular economy as maximizing those principles. Can you, Devika, start with you, speak to how that can help in the cement industry?
So, I mean that's a valid point, and I think I answered one of the questions something related to this as well. So, when we are talking about processing of waste, I think Indians, not Indian, but I think the global cement industry is already using alternate fuels, wherein we use that co-processed waste is also used as alternate fuels. Now, when we when we talk about so in Europe, we are using almost 60 to 80% comes from the energy comes from the alternate waste. But so every continent has different, percentages of using waste. But I think, we have to do everything that needs to be done to, and I agree with that. Recycling is going to be, one of the major, things to be thought about when we talk about circular economy. And similarly, and specifically in cement, because, when it comes to construction waste, or when it comes to, so yeah, I think it's going to be important, and it needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Thoughts from others on circular economy?
I mean, maybe to jump in on that. I mean, circularity it's a bit of a confusing term, right? Because it means a lot of different things, and very different things for different industries. I think fundamentally and it is part of a circularity or circularity policy is basically demand reduction. And I think that's where we, especially in developed countries, we should be leading the fray, where we are very material and carbon intensive economies that can't serve as a development model for the rest of the world, because then we're never going to get there. I think when you look at, for example, the steel industry, which is, steel is fundamentally not endlessly recyclable, but it is recyclable, right? And we do recycle most of it. There are things you can tweak still around, how we treat scrap and how we, how do we make that more efficient? How do we make sure that our design is recyclable, etc. But I think fundamentally what it will come down to, and whether we can decarbonize the steel industry, is whether we can shift a trajectory of the last 15 years, which has been around increasingly more production of steel and demand of steel, as a lot of the developing countries around the world, or global south countries, are building out their infrastructure, to a scenario where we fundamentally sort of like detach steel needs from economic growth. And if you look at some of those steel projections going forward by 2050, there's about like a 50% difference in some of the scenarios in terms of how much steel we will consume in 2050. 50% is literally half the problem only through material efficiency. And beyond technologies which are important, I think that's definitely something we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Absolutely. One other technology we've touched on but not addressed directly is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It's become it's controversial in terms of folks really fearing that it's going to become too big a part of the solution. But I think it'd be useful for us to talk a little bit about what is the role of carbon capture and utilization in industry, because it does feel like of all the sectors that could benefit from CCS and CCUS, industry is top among them. So Noah, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, happy to. And I'll maybe have a potentially unexpected take on this, which I think carbon capture is almost always the last resort technology if you can't do something else. The issue is that in the industrial sector, we can't do something else fairly often, or we're not able to do something else at scale in a financeable way in many cases today. I think the process emissions associated with cement are a great example, where even if you used 100% renewables and electrified everything that you could, if you were still to make cement with all of that, you would have the process emissions associated with burning limestone until we find a substitute material. And I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do that in the coming decades. But the challenge is, how do we actually decarbonize today? And CCS is ready. It's a technology that has been developed for the past 50 plus years at this point. We have an immense amount of data to suggest that it can be cost effective, safe, and scalable. And so I think the question is, how do we sequence these technologies and know that we're going to have a next generation of material replacements, efficiencies, and renewable energy in the future? How do we make smart investments in carbon capture today that are going to drive reductions in CO2 in a major way over the next 2 decades or so, but not lock in an infrastructure and crowd out that next wave of investments? And I think it's something that we are certainly doing here at DOE. I think as a good rule, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides about $60 billion in funding for a whole range of climate technologies, many of which are directly relevant to the industrial sector. About 12 billion of that is going to carbon capture and the broader value chain. And so that 20% is, I think, a reasonable investment compared to the broader clean energy transformation that will enable us to actually make progress and scale up carbon capture and sequestration in the near term, realize the climate benefit, but also make sure that we're providing ourselves with the option to leapfrog that technology in the not too distant future, while also maintaining the option to scale up the carbon capture industry if some of that innovation doesn't materialize in the time frame that we need.
Thank you. It's a very thoughtful answer. Another hot topic.
Can I
Please.
just add a couple of things? I think Noha mentioned it, and in CCUS, we've seen CCUS across sectors. In oil and gas, they have been doing it. Power industry is already doing it, and steel and now cement. So all hard to abate sectors are already doing. And like Noah said, we need to learn from each other. We can't reinvent the wheel every time we talk about CCUS. So we need to take learnings from each other. That's how we are going to accelerate decarbonization of hard to abate sectors. And I think the second important point is investing in technology development and scale-ups. That is another, I would say, very important aspect when it comes to CCUS deployment. I like to use this phrase, Rome was not built in a day. So we need to start making these small investments in developing the technology framework for CCUS. To give you an example, GCCA runs two innovation platforms. So one is Innovandi Research Network, wherein we are working on the grassroots research at an academic level where we support PhDs. We are working with a lot of universities, global universities. That's one program that we do. And I lead their Innovandi Open Challenge, which deals with, we invite startups all over the world, and we have over 40 global cement companies. So we pair these startups with this mentors from, the cement industry, who can not only mentor them, but at the same time also fine tune the technology, because, there's no one size fit all in CCUS. It's not that, one technology can be, used anywhere and everywhere. But so investing in the right kind of technology and maybe the startup technology is at a lower, I'm sorry if I'm using too technical terms, we call it technology readiness level. If it has a low TRL, and it might be an outstanding technology and it might solve our problem for carbon capture, but at the same time, if there's no investment in developing that technology and scaling it up, that's the big gap here. So GCCA is trying to, we have like last year, we launched our first open challenge, which was specific to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration technologies. And in that we formed 6 consortiums, which is a group of startup, which is a startup with a group of cement companies, and then whether they require a space for a pilot or are we talking about testing. So we all work in a consortium. This is to help cement and the challenges what the cement industry faces in real real sense. It's not like what theoretically works. No, it's like real-time cement industry. What are the challenges? How can we fine-tune these technologies so that we can implement them in a real plant? And we have 2 pilots which are part of that consortium. So the reason I wanted to mention this is innovation is going to be the key. We can't just have technologies deployed and they might not work in every sector. Yeah, thank you.
Lots of learning to be had, and I think it's going to happen quickly in the next few years. Dominique, you had a thought on that, or can I switch to hydrogen?
If I may, for like a minute, because actually I pretty much agree with a lot of what Noah and Devika said, especially around like CCS. It's never the default option, or it shouldn't be. But also think that when we talk about policies around CCS and especially financing that, and maybe that's where my EU regulatory background comes in a little bit, but I do think that we need to have very good conversations, one around what the role of public financing is around CCS, especially comparing different sectors, because as Devika said, not all CCS is the same, but definitely not all sectors need CCS, and quite often CCS is made available through financial incentives through a lot of different sectors, and definitely a lot of sectors that don't technically need it are hiding behind the need for CCS to not act on climate action. So I think we need to very carefully look at different sectors and really see where do you need it, where don't you need it. And then secondly, have different kind of policies to incentivize CCS for different sectors as well. I think for a lot of the, if I think about fossil fuel power or energy generation, etc., for our side, like we see a lot less a role for public finance or public investments there, and a lot more a role for regulation and standards that need to drive those investments by those actors themselves if they want to make use of CCS, which is not or shouldn't be the default option for those sectors.
Appreciate that. I'm going to pause on hydrogen just for a second, because I think what's coming up in the chat is a real interest in getting real practical about how can we increase climate finance from both public and private and multilateral banks to achieve the decarbonization of industry that'll really enable those net zero goals to be met. Anyone want to start on the climate finance question?
I can start. I mean, I can give it a shot, but It's a tough one, to be honest. But let's look at. We are looking at the big picture. We are looking of an investment which might, if for a small pilot, it might go from 1 million to 5 million. Also, I mean, you really don't know what the range is depending on what kind of technology. So there are a lot of parameters how you decide the cost of a pilot or a cost of a plant, right? So it is not only dependent on the technology, the site where the plant you want to implement, that will have implications and lots of other factors. But so we always look at the big picture here, but I think what needs to be understood is, let's start small. Let's start looking at, how can we develop different frameworks, and how can we, start small. Let's not start on the 100th step that we have. We can always start with like 2 steps, 3 steps at a time, wherein the financial commitment as well is not that big. We can start with when we form clusters, or we do studies on hubs. That is very useful, right? It's very useful to start with that, because it gives you a perspective. Right now with CCUS, what happens is we see the big picture, and then we look at the finance numbers, and oh my God, it's too much. It's too much for the industry. It is too much for a bank. I think it's a very tough commitment, and the questions like, who will be liable, who will be held liable if this works, it doesn't work. There are a lot of risks involved in it. Now, to be honest, in hard-to-abate sectors, the risk is quite high, and with a high return of investment, it doesn't seem to be working out or whatever. But I think starting small would be a good way to bring in the confidence, not only from the finance sector but also industry, and everybody. Going back to my point, collaboration is the only way. I mean, we don't have to start from looking at the big picture, but we can take small steps, and I think that is happening. And I see a lot of traction from multilateral banks as well. We have to start somewhere, to be honest. So,
well, it strikes me that there was a lot of hesitance, reticence to invest in electric vehicles, to invest in solar. I wonder how much just education needs to be happening among these institutions, as well as some de-risking, as you talked about, to make it a little safer for investment. Any other thoughts on climate finance? Okay. So back to hydrogen. Some of my colleagues who came away from the Clean Energy Ministerial were really struck by the differences of opinion on standards for hydrogen, and how standards ought to be set, and what constitutes green hydrogen. Is the color system even the way to go? Should it be more of a carbon intensity measure? My big questions are, are we over-relying on hydrogen as the promise for decarbonizing the industry sector? And is there a need sooner rather than later to agree on those standards? Noah, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think it's really important that we have carbon intensity as the backbone for any decisions on hydrogen, and that we think of it as a systems challenge, because especially as we're thinking about what's the highest and best use of clean electrons as we transition to a net zero grid, we're still not quite at the place of a real abundance of those clean electrons. And so it's imperative to think about how we use the hydrogen that we can get in the near, mid, and long term in the most effective way. I would say we're not over relying on hydrogen today, because we're not really relying on it in the near term deployment scenarios. I think we need to do a lot more to get to the place where we can even have that conversation. And so I think efforts like the hydrogen hubs that DOE is funding, and many of the innovative demand mechanisms, not just the tax credit, but what DOE and countries around the world are doing around contracts for difference and other types of market pull technologies, are going to be really important for getting hydrogen pulled into the system, and really to understand the promise and how to scale it in a smart way.
Domain, you want to go next?
Yeah, if I can jump into that. I'm not going to talk necessarily about standards for hydrogen, because then I might say things that my hydrogen team doesn't agree with. I think when it comes to the role of hydrogen in industry, I think I'm not necessarily saying we're over relying in hydrogen in terms of like energy pathways or decarbonization pathways, but you can definitely see that there is an overhype around green hydrogen and the amount of decarbonization that can that can trigger not only in industry where it is probably needed in quite a few sectors. We also have quite a bit of gray or black hydrogen consumption right now, which should definitely be among the first sectors we're talking about. But a lot of the conversations in Europe right now are about massive upscaling of hydrogen in the near future, which is not necessarily building on domestic infrastructure and production, but a lot of banking and betting on massive imports in the future. And I do think that's a very risky strategy. Definitely the import strategy, which is currently, as Noah said, like that there is no green hydrogen being imported. There's barely any hydrogen in general being transported along long distances. And that is not something that is tested and trialed and tested. And doing that in combination with exploring hydrogen boilers in home heating and hydrogen for transportation, etc. Like I do think we are. I mean, there's a risk of utilizing, which is essentially a scarce resource in the wrong way.
I see that. I've been struck, and I've only been really working in this field for a couple of years, but I'm already struck by the fact that we said, oh, we have to have hydrogen for those industries that require high temperature heat. And yet there's been developments, I think, in electrification and in other technologies that are beginning to tackle that high temperature heat. Can you all talk about how what you think the potential is for electrification of our most carbon intensive industries and how mature those technologies are?
I'm not an expert in this field, but what I understand is, in addition to, definitely hydrogen is getting a lot of traction, and electrification, yes, it could solve one of the many challenges of heat intensive industry. It will definitely, that's, but to be honest, Angela, I am again, like what you said, pros and cons, safe, not safe. I've been in those discussions, so I truly don't have a take of saying that, yes, let's do it, but that might have an answer. But that happens with almost every breakthrough technology. We don't trust in the beginning, but then, things seem to change. So to be honest, at this point of time, I really don't know, but like I said, I'm not an expert in that area. And, but, maybe having a little faith, because I'm thinking if hydrogen, if the whole green hydrogen thing really works, it will push for more CCU based routes. So my optimistic thinking is more banking on that side of it. So that'll be my opinion.
Great.
I think I have a bit of a different view, perhaps, on electrification, which I think. Yes, there are lots of technical solutions that even in direct electrification already exist. It's definitely not as sexy or as hyped as hydrogen right now. But in terms of like technical limitations, there is no real reason why electricity-based production processes can't reach the same heat levels than combustion can. And there are existing technologies in certain industrial sectors that do reach significant temperatures as well. I think, because we're quite often talking about green hydrogen and CCS, which are quite often needed in those like industries with a lot of process emissions or in industries that require high heat, we quite often forget that even the majority of natural gas use is used in industries with use temperatures up to 100, 150, 200 degrees Celsius. Those sometimes hide behind the hard to abate framing as well, but they're really easy to electrify. I think we have massive progress that we're witnessing in the heat pump industry, not just for domestic use, but also for industrial use. Those temperatures do go up to, easily 100, but also 150 and higher. There are other solar-based solutions that can reach higher temperatures. So I think the vast bulk of fossil fuel usage in industry, manufacturing industry broadly, will be electrified. Technical potential is probably limitless over time. I think short term we're talking 50 to 70%, but that's the majority.
No, a question specifically to you, but this is always true in other countries too. I think one thing that folks worry about is whether a change in administration could threaten the progress that we're seeing in the US. Any thoughts you'd like to share on that? Give us a ray of hope that we're not going to step back again.
Yeah, more than a ray of hope. I think what matters is Congress, and these incentives have been appropriated and put into law by Congress. And so the administration is tasked with implementing them. I fully expect that without some sort of massive change in the congressional makeup here, which we do not expect, that these incentives will be very robust to a change in administration. And so I'm not worried about any significant change or slowdown to what's currently been implemented. I think the key challenge, though, is we need an administration that's willing to work with Congress to recognize that the two policies that I mentioned serve as a down payment on decarbonization, not the full mortgage, if you will. And so we need to continue to work as a country to make sure that there are continued investments in deep decarbonization across the value chain. And we need to shift out of this framework that we're kind of done with climate policy for the indefinite future, and need to really pull forward the window of how we continue to support this and recognize that this is something that will require future policy if we want it to really achieve the climate impacts that we want, not just get us started and buy us the option of doing that in the future.
Just to close us out a little bit, one of the first principles of the Systems Change Lab is that one of the things we're going to have to do, one of the shifts we have to make, is to reduce demand. And I wonder if folks can speak to a little bit, maybe talk about the limitations of growth regarding industry, manufacturing, and the economy and a sustainable society. Do we need unlimited growth in consumption moving forward, or can we work a little smarter and sort of change some of our both lifestyle and industrial practices in ways that just are a little gentler on the need for resources in the planet? I'm just thinking specifically, this is kind of the circular economy question, but a little bit more broad.
It is, and I do think, maybe just to kick us off with that, because it's definitely a very heated debate in Europe right now, where I think a lot of our recent political answers to recent challenges have been very supply-driven policies, being it on supply of energy, supply of new materials, extraction of resources, or just domestic manufacturing capacity. A lot of the focus is on more and doing all that value add domestically in Europe, which I think is a bit of it's a dangerous signal, sort of like about where the politics lie around all of this. And I do think we're fundamentally, and I said that before as well, like we are fundamentally under leveraging the role that demand reduction, energy efficiency, etc., can do. The issue is that is not an easy fix solution. It quite often requires changes in personal habit, in consumption habits, in how we do businesses, how our business model operate, etc. It is a very difficult paradigm to shift in what is essentially, a capitalist market-based economy. And I think there are lots of interesting intellectual discussions happening, which are very difficult and contentious to translate in policy terms. But I think what is clear, and probably most people agree with that, is that if we, maintain on the trajectory we have been in the last, 50 years, 150 years, we're not going to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just speak from the US perspective, where back to what was possible with Congress, we had decades where regulating CO2 emissions and telling people that we didn't want that failed to actually get the political traction. And as soon as we said, we'll give you money to do the things that we want you to do, all of a sudden the political calculus shifted. And so I don't see that political system changing in the that calculus and those dynamics shifting anytime in the near future. But what I do see is that there is both an amazing amount of innovation happening in the US, not just from these public investments, but coming out of the Silicon Valley ecosystem that I think offer the potential to revolutionize manufacturing and heavy industry in really positive ways in the future. And I think for the first time, a real recognition from the environmental community that we need to think about how do we build the things that we want as quickly as we need, which is a real shift from how the environmental community has thought about environmental protection, at least here in the US, over the past 50 years, which has been about how do we stop the stuff that we don't want. And so we're certainly we're far away from figuring out what an answer from the environmental side is to how do we actually deploy the climate technology that we need. But in the next decade or so, I'm really optimistic that we'll have enormous tailwinds on both of those fronts that are coming from outside of the climate field per se, but offer us tools where we'll look back on this conversation in even just a few years and realize that the toolkit and the political dynamics are starting to shift in really important ways.
I think that's right.
Just to add a couple of things, I don't have a lot of points. I agree with Dominic. It's a chicken and an egg problem. With development at its peak, it's not that we will stop developing infrastructures, right? That's not going to happen. So this is that transition. We cannot stop at that, right? So this will, the infrastructure, need for infrastructure and everything will have to be in place. But what can we do is an interesting thought. And I this is just top of my head, but I'm thinking when we are developing infrastructures or when we are developing buildings, or we are putting all those things in place, why not like what Noah said, have some incentives. Why do you want to drive this? Oh, I would like to use low carbon cement, or maybe we can calculate the embodied carbon in the building and then decide how the next these kind of construction or these infrastructures can be in place when we look at the right kind of technology. And technology solutions are out there. But yes, so always the debate is about cost. But in order to do any change, we will have to provide incentives. We'll have to educate, and educate and uneducate at the same time. Learning and unlearning is like the same part of the parcel. Making sure that the next infrastructure that we develop is more responsible. We are using much more responsible materials than what we have been doing in the past. In addition to that, when we talk about lifestyle changes, some of us might be really trying hard to do lifestyle changes, but considering the way climate change has taken shape and the temperatures are soared up, how do we decide whether we will switch on the aircon or we will just decide to, sit there without the aircon? I mean, I'm just trying to put things in perspective. What is practical and what is not practical? I agree that it has to be responsible for every individual, but the practicality may or may not work. I mean, that's just my opinion. I'm just trying to put things in perspective.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Perspective is key. I think we're in for a lot of very positive changes over the next few years. I would really thank you all for your time in this really robust discussion. You've been more than generous with your time. So Noah, Dominique, Devika, thank you so much for your thoughts today, and to the audience for such wonderful, insightful questions that you submitted to keep us going today. We're grateful you joined us, and we'd encourage you to visit the Systems Change Lab and our Industrial Innovation Project if you'd like to learn more about dive deeper into these topics. And with that, we'll sign up, and thank you all for joining us today. There will be a recording available of this conversation. So thank you very much. Have a good day.